Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you one of my head-to-head comparisons, and I'm reviewing two of the premium 135mm lenses that exist on the market in general, and the only two options that exist on Nikon Z mount. One of those is Nikon's own Nikkor Z 135mm f1.8s Plena, and then we have Viltrox's autofocusing 135mm f1.8 Lab series lens in Z mount. I've had the opportunity over the last 6 weeks to review both of these amazing 135mm lenses, which is great considering that 18 months ago we had zero 135mm lenses on Nikon Z mount. Both of these have tremendous strengths, and they also have a lot of similarities, as we're going to find. But they are priced radically different, with the Lab coming in around $900 US. The Plena is closer to $2,500 US. So, is the Plena worth it? Does the Lab make the Plena irrelevant? Well, the answer is surprisingly kind of complicated. So today we're going to dive in and try to break down where the strengths lie. I want to say a thank you to Viltrox for providing the Lab lens for this comparison, and to Nikon Canada for supplying a Plena, and so that we can have this showdown today. So let's start by talking about what is similar. And this is a short list because there's actually a lot of similarities, but obviously both have the same focal length, they both have the same maximum aperture, they have a fairly similar feature set, though there is some areas of differentiation that we will dive into here today. Both of them have professional grade builds with thorough weather sealing. They have very robust casings, bodies to them, and they both feel like premium lenses because that's exactly what they are. Surprisingly, they both have roughly similar autofocus speed, and the overall performance of autofocus feels more similar than different. And in terms of just basic going back and forth, as you can see from these comparison shots, really there's not a whole lot different that's going on between the two of them. And that was true on a lot of different metrics. Optically, they're also very, very similar, and I'll try to point out the nuances where they're a little bit different here today. But as you can see from these portrait comparison shots, it's pretty hard to, if I were doing a blind test, I'm pretty skeptical that too many in the audience could tell me which was which. They have a very similar amount of resolution and contrast. They have similar overall rendering. Even the color signature is quite similar between the two lenses. And so in many ways, they're very, very comparable optically. Now, as far as a slight difference between the two, that really doesn't add up to much. One is wider in diameter, the Plena lens. One is longer, the Lab series lenses. But if you calculate their internal mass, they're both within about 1% of each other. And so they're basically the same size, though not the same weight, which we'll get to in just a moment. So let's start by talking about reasons to choose the Lab. The Lab is the new lens on the market. Obviously, it's attractive in many ways, but the first thing that it's most attractive for, and probably the number one reason to choose it over the Plena, is the price. It's currently $899 US, a bit less if you use the discount and the code that's down below. And the Plena is around $2,500, so that's about a $1,600 difference between the two. As is so often with these third-party lenses, if you took price out of the equation and you said, well, which would you choose if price is no object? I would say probably 99.9% would choose the first-party Nikon lens. But obviously, we don't get to take price out of the equation, and in this case, that price difference is vast. And so obviously, that's going to be a pretty significant factor. Now, the second reason to choose the Lab is that if you're looking for a specific feature set, surprisingly, it's the Lab lens that actually has more options as far as controls. It's also more customizable. It does feature the LCD screen on the front, and so that will allow you a few different things that you can't do with the Plena lens. You can set A/B focus, for example, and program that using that. Obviously, it's going to give you a distance scale. It's going to allow you to see your current aperture right on the screen there. So definitely some extra features there. And beyond that, there also are some just features absolutely missing from on the Plena lens that are here on the Lab. And so one of those is a focus limiter. We have a 3-position focus limiter on the Lab that doesn't exist on the Plena. You have the option of clicking and declicking the aperture, and so again, an option that you don't have on the Plena, and so just a few more features that are there as well. Now, far less significant because both of them are extremely, extremely minimal when it comes to distortion, but the Lab does have a little bit less. It's basically 100% neutral, whereas the Plena has the tiniest amount of pincushion distortion. I certainly wouldn't make my decision based on that factor alone. However, it is one area of differentiation between the two. Interestingly, I think you could probably make the argument that the Lab lens has the nicer build set. And if nothing else, it definitely has the nicer hood. The hood is much nicer, it's more robust, has that rubberized front edge. It feels like a premium hood. Well, frankly, I found in my review of the Plena, the included lens hood with it feels a little bit cheap, actually. But in terms of the overall materials here, the Lab has a really gorgeous build quality. And one thing it doesn't have is this weird pseudo third ring that's on the Plena lens, which I have not yet been able to figure out why it's there. It doesn't rotate, it's just, but it has a rubberized grip surface like it is an additional ring that's there. And again, these two lenses are really, really similar optically, as we're going to see, but of the two, the Plena is, as we'll get to in a moment, it's a little bit sharper in the center, I would say, whereas the Lab is better in the mid frame. The corners are kind of a wash, but there might be a slight edge in the corner performance there as well. One final area that is a little bit more obvious is that the Lab lens, it has floating elements inside. And so you might hear a little bit of a clunk if you shake it back and forth like this when it's not attached and turned on. But the reason for that is that floating elements allow it to focus about 10 centimeters closer than what the Plena does and thus achieve a significantly higher level of magnification. The Plena is capable of 0.20 times, whereas the Lab lens can focus down to 0.25 times. And so it's going to give you a higher level of magnification. Both of them are very good at their minimum focus distance. However, it gives you more magnification, thus a little bit more versatility in its design. So those are some of the reasons to choose the Lab lens. How about some reasons to choose the Plena? Well, the Plena, though both lenses are very similar in size, the Plena is very obviously lighter. Doesn't mean that it's a light lens, but it is considerably lighter than what the Lab. The Lab is a very heavy lens, and so at 995 grams for the Plena, it's about 273 grams less than the Lab, which is 1,268 grams. And by the way, you definitely can feel that difference in weight. The Lab feels just more dense and heavy relative to the Plena lens, which is heavy, but it's definitely a lot lighter. One kind of significant thing for me is that while the aperture can be declicked on the Lab, if you're using the control ring, which they both feature, they have that customizable control ring that can be used either as an aperture ring, but also can be used for exposure compensation, can be used for ISO, for different things like that. But if you're using it for aperture control, you can do smooth aperture racks on the Plena lens that look very natural, look very much like a manual aperture ring on a Cine lens. But on the Viltrox lens, even declicked, you see very visible steps on Nikon as you try to stop down or open up that aperture. And so it's not cinematic at all. I wouldn't use that at all. And so as far as doing that kind of thing, the aperture control on, or the ability to declick the aperture on the Lab lens becomes pointless. Whereas on the Plena lens, you definitely can do those aperture racks. I also noted with the Lab lens that the Lab lens, number one, it doesn't have nearly as good a feel to its manual focus lens or focus ring, whereas the Plena has a really beautifully damp manual focus ring. More importantly, however, than just the feel, I found that I could do smoother focus pulls manually than what I could with the Lab lens, where again, I felt like there's just a little bit of a stepping quality to the manual focus as well. Whereas you get that smooth, uninterrupted manual focus that is a very, very good manual focus simulation on the Plena. And so for some of those video kind of specific features like that, aperture racking and manual focus pulls, the Plena is the much nicer lens to use as they stand right now. The Plena has a very unique design, particularly with the glass and the rear element, where they really design with the intent of making the lens as evenly illuminated as possible, so reducing vignette almost exclusively, but then also allowing for very, very round specular highlights. And so let's look at both of those things as being advantageous. Now, ironically, the Lab is actually the second best out of probably all of the existing 135 millimeter lenses right now, but the Plena is the best in that regard. And if you really love perfectly round specular highlights all across the frame, the Plena does a better job with that than any 135 millimeter lens that I've tested before. There's none of that kind of cat eye or lemon shape towards the edge of the frame. And so it really produces really lovely looking specular highlights. And so that's great. It also has almost no vignette, a very, very tiny amount, whereas the Lab lens has about 2 stops worth of vignette on Nikon, which is kind of ironic because the E-mount version of the Lab lens it was very much like the Plena. It showed almost no kind of vignette at all. And so anyway, the Plena in its rear element design, particularly here on Nikon, it just does a better job with both of those metrics. I also found that whereas overall focus speed is about similar between them, I did find that focus was a little bit more reactive with the Plena. And so I could nab things where I had to really quickly adjust and pull focus. I could do it better on the Plena than what I could with the Lab. I also found that I got greater focus consistency. When I did a portrait session using both lenses, recreating the same shots again and again at different distances, I got just higher accuracy overall. I got very close to 100% accuracy with the Plena, whereas I probably was more in the range of 75 to 80% accuracy with the Lab lens in those identical situations. And so definitely, if you really, really need to rely on portrait consistency, then I would say the Plena stands out above the Lab lens at this point. Now, neither one of these lenses really impressed me all that much on Nikon when it came to doing things like autofocus pulls for video and just showing general reactiveness. There's just quirks. You can see pulses and racks in the wrong direction. Just a lot of stuff that I'm generally unimpressed with. However, of the two, neither one is great, but the Plena is better and the Lab is worse. And so if that's something that you're going to actually need to rely on, prepare for some frustration, but the Plena will give you less than what the Lab will. And finally, in head-to-head wide open sharpness, I felt like the Plena was the sharper lens in the center of the frame, and that also remained true as you stopped it down a little bit. Both of these lenses are fabulously sharp, by the way, and so it's not a huge metric to make your decision on, but again, if you're wanting to know which was sharper in my test in the middle, it was the Plena. So that leads me to my conclusion. I would say that it's safe to say that the differences in performance between these two lenses are subtle. As I just said, they are both incredible optically, but I did encounter more quirks just in using the lens with the Viltrox than what I did with the first-party Plena lens. I really feel like the Viltrox is due a firmware update. For example, it's still at this point, I find in Lightroom, for example, that while the name is correct in there, the focal length reports as 16 millimeters rather than 135 millimeters. It's just little quirks like that where there's a few bugs that need to be squashed with the Lab lens that haven't been done yet. You know, it's been out for about a month now, and so that hasn't happened yet. And so the Plena just feels like the more polished, finished, stable product. There was moments when I was using them side by side where I was pretty clearly reminded of which was the first-party lens and which was the third-party lens. So I would still call the Plena the better lens. And again, if you remove price from the consideration, I would say I would choose the Plena. But $1,600 difference in price is a lot of money. And I think the case could easily be made that the Lab has given you, 90 to 95% of the performance of the Plena, and you could buy 2.7 of these Lab lenses for the price of one Plena. And for many people who maybe aren't earning money professionally from the photography, that's going to make the Lab the more easy choice. It's a great lens for the money, and if you go with it, I think you're going to be delighted with it. If you're a professional who is earning your living doing portrait or wedding work or things like that, I would say maybe spending the money on the Plena will be worth it because I feel like it's going to just give you a higher percentage of keepers, and that obviously can make all the difference if you're shooting professionally. So food for thought. If you want more information on either one of these lenses, I have all of my reviews linked in the description down below, both text and video on both of them. There's buying links there. And of course, as always, I hope that this has helped you out today. Thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in. Okay, here's a little bonus for those of you who stick around to the end. I'll give you a few comparisons really head to head, and so you can maybe make some further decisions for yourself. Plena is going to be on the left, the lab is going to be on the right. 200% magnification, and you can see on the 45 megapixel Z8 in the center of the frame, it's all Plena, looking sharper and crisper. Mid-frame, however, the pendulum swings, and now the Viltrox is the sharper of the two. If we pop down here into the corner, they're similar. However, if you look at this zone here right out towards the edge, the Viltrox is holding on to sharpness a little bit further, a little bit more consistently. If we look over on the left side here, we can see that Viltrox is a little bit sharper with the lab lens, and up into this left corner, we can see that it's a little bit closer here in this corner. I would say that I might favor the Plena a little bit. And so you can see that as far as sharpness goes, the pendulum kind of swings back and forth. Now, both of these lenses have very good minimum focus distance performance. You can see that the magnification level, as we've already said, does favor the Viltrox. As far as the overall performance up close, I would say that they are close, but I think the Plena is ever so slightly better up close, just a little bit more detail being resolved. If we look at that with a three-dimensional object, you can see here that the magnification level, yes, is higher on the Viltrox. Both of them are really impressively good here with a three-dimensional object up close. Obviously, depth of field is going to be a little more shallow with the Viltrox because of the higher magnification. But if you look at this zone, they're both very good. You may not be able to see it on your screen, but on mine at 4K here with the original RAWs, I think that the Plena is ever so slightly sharper there, but I mean, both of them are excellent. And again, because of depth of field with something three-dimensional, you don't want to draw too many conclusions. Both of them are great, but the Plena is excellent at the minimum focus. Now, as noted, the Viltrox is far from the worst performer when it comes to the cat eye shape. It's actually better than any other lens save the Plena as far as 135 millimeters that I reviewed. However, the Plena is exceptional, and you can see here there's a little bit of a deformation there in the corner that's nice and round here on the Plena. Also, in this case, it's squeezing a little bit, whereas the Plena is a much rounder shape. So if that's a big deal to you, well, the Plena is the winner there. Finally, we'll take a look at a few portrait comparisons where I have tried to equalize things as much as possible. So you can see, looking at the images overall, the Plena image and the lab image, they look really remarkably similar. And so as far as looking at the subject looks very, very similar. Not much of a difference there to point to. As far as the out of focus areas, again, I would say to my eye, they look more similar than different. I mean, this is a complicated subject with water streaming over this rock, but I mean, both of them look fairly soft. Both of them look very similar. And, you know, throughout the clothes and all of that, I mean, even the colors, they're very, very similar. Hard to call a winner there. Here with a closer look, this is f3.2 on both, same shutter speed. You can see that they look really, really remarkably similar. Look at the defocus area, and again, it looks very similar on both of them. And if we punch into the face and the skin tones, you can see that it's really remarkably similar. I do think there's maybe just a little bit more contrast, for example, in the beard on the Plena versus the lab. But again, if you didn't have them side by side, could you tell that difference? I'm kind of skeptical that you could. One final shot here at f1.8. And again, if you just look at the image as a whole, if I were to, cycle off the information, switch them around, do you feel like you could tell which is which? Maybe you do, maybe you don't, but the reality is they're very, very close. I do think in this zone, I think that the Plena is just a little bit smoother than what the lab lens is, but outside of that, there's not a whole lot of difference there. I do think that I was a hair closer with the Plena, which helps a little bit with the background, but I mean, just don't draw too many conclusions from that. As far as the sharpness, the color, the detail, I mean, I don't know. I don't see a difference. Maybe you do, and so that's why I'm showing it to you. But bottom line is that both of these lenses do produce very similar results in a portrait type setting.